April 1943, Davao Penal Colony, Mindanao. The Japanese guards had counted him every morning for 11 months. They knew his face, his number, his slow, compliant shuffle across the compound. Samuel Grashio was another broken American, starving, diseased, defeated. The guards had stopped watching him closely months ago. He smiled at them sometimes. They assumed it was surrender. It was not. What happened next would become the only successful mass escape from a Japanese prison camp in the entire Pacific War. The mathematics of survival at Davao Penal Colony were brutally simple. The camp sat in the interior of Mindanao, surrounded by 20 miles of jungle in every direction. Beyond the jungle lay Japanese patrols, headhunter tribes whose loyalty shifted with circumstance, and a coastline controlled entirely by Imperial Navy vessels. The nearest Allied-held territory was over 500 miles away. The guards carried rifles. The prisoners carried dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and the slow collapse of bodies that had been systematically starved for over a year. Escape attempts from Japanese prison camps across the Pacific had produced a near-perfect failure rate. Those who tried were caught within days, sometimes hours. The punishments were designed to eliminate not just the escapees, but the very concept of resistance. 10 men executed for everyone who fled. Public beheadings. Torture extended across weeks to ensure every prisoner understood the price. At Davao, the Japanese had refined their system further. The compound was divided into groups of 10. Each group was collectively responsible for the others. If one man ran, the remaining 9 would face execution. This mathematical certainty had paralyzed escape planning more effectively than any fence or guard tower. The prisoners knew the equation. Every man who considered running had to weigh his own survival against 9 lives he would leave behind to die. Samuel Gracio understood this calculation better than most. He had watched friends deteriorate from dysentery, their bodies unable to retain enough nutrition to fight the constant assault of tropical disease. He had buried men who had survived the Bataan Death March, only to die from a single infected wound that American field hospitals could have treated in hours. The daily rice ration hovered around 800 calories. The labor demands burned twice that. The deficit was paid in muscle mass, organ function, and the slow erosion of cognitive clarity that preceded death. By the spring of 1943, Gracio weighed approximately 100 pounds. Before the war, he had been a muscular pilot who passed every physical examination with ease. Now his ribs were visible through skin that had taken on the yellowish cast of liver dysfunction. The guards saw this deterioration and interpreted it correctly as submission. A man fighting starvation does not plan elaborate escapes. He plans his next meal, he conserves energy, he becomes predictable. This predictability was the foundation of Japanese confidence. The prisoners at Davao had been sorted and broken. They worked the agricultural fields during the day, returned to their barracks at night, and waited for a war that seemed to have forgotten them. What the guards failed to recognize was that starvation also strips away the fear of death. When survival probability drops below a certain threshold, the calculation changes. The men who remained at Davao after a year of captivity were not ordinary prisoners. They were the ones whose bodies had somehow refused to quit, whose immune systems had fought off infections that killed others, whose minds had found ways to remain functional despite caloric deprivation that should have produced permanent cognitive damage. They were the statistical outliers, the ones whose biology had already defied the odds, and among them, a small group had begun to think differently about those 20 miles of jungle. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Samuel Charles Grashio was born in 1918 in Spokane, Washington, to parents who had immigrated from Italy. His father worked as a barber, cutting hair for the working families of the Pacific Northwest during the Depression years when every quarter mattered. The Grashio household operated on principles of practical economy. Waste was sinful. Opportunity was earned through work rather than luck. Young Samuel absorbed these lessons without ceremony, the way children learn values by watching their parents navigate scarcity with dignity. He was drawn to aviation the way many young men of his generation were drawn to it. The barnstormers and air races of the 1930s had transformed flight from a curiosity into a symbol of modern capability. Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic alone. Amelia Earhart had pushed boundaries that newspapers covered with breathless excitement. For a barber's son in Spokane, aviation represented something beyond the economic constraints of his childhood. It was a technical field where talent and discipline could override social position. The Army Air Corps did not ask about family wealth when evaluating pilot candidates. It asked whether you could fly. Gracio pursued his pilot training through the Civilian Pilot Training Program, one of the Roosevelt administration's initiatives to build a reserve of trained aviators as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia. The program took college students and young professionals and gave them the fundamentals of flight at minimal cost. He excelled. His instructors noted his spatial awareness, his calm under pressure, his ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously while maintaining aircraft control. These were not qualities that could be easily taught. They emerged from some combination of neurological wiring and disciplined practice. By 1941, Gracio had earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces. His assignment was the 21st Pursuit Squadron, based at Nichols Field in the Philippines. The 21st flew P-40 Warhawks, the workhorse fighter of the American pre-war arsenal. The P-40 was not the most advanced aircraft in the world. Its performance ceiling was lower than Japanese fighters. Its rate of climb was mediocre. But it was rugged, it was available, and it rewarded pilots who understood its limitations. Gracio learned the P-40 the way he had learned everything else, through systematic practice and careful observation. He studied the aircraft's performance envelope, memorized the speeds at which various maneuvers became dangerous, and internalized the cockpit procedures until they required no conscious thought. His squadron mates described him as quiet but competent. He did not seek attention. He did not boast about his flying skills. He simply performed his duties with the kind of reliability that made commanders trust him for difficult assignments. The Philippines in late 1941 was a strange posting. Everyone knew war with Japan was possible, perhaps probable. But the base operations continued with a peacetime rhythm that seemed disconnected from the intelligence reports filtering through command channels. Grashio flew patrol missions. He participated in training exercises. He wrote letters home that mentioned the tropical heat and the quality of the mess hall food and the camaraderie of squadron life. He did not write about the anxiety that permeated the junior officer ranks. The sense that their aircraft were aging, their supplies inadequate, their defensive positions poorly prepared for the scale of attack that Japanese forces could deliver. The last peacetime Sunday of his life was December 7, 1941. Across the international dateline, it was already December 8 in the Philippines when the news arrived from Hawaii. Everything he had trained for was about to be tested. Everything he believed about himself was about to be stripped away. The Japanese attack on the Philippines began hours after Pearl Harbor, but communication failures and confusion delayed American responses in ways that would prove catastrophic. Clark Field, the main American air base north of Manila, was struck while aircraft were lined up on the ground. The warning had come. The pilots had been briefed, but contradictory orders and the fog of first-day chaos kept many planes on the tarmac when Japanese bombers arrived overhead. At Nichols Field, where Grashio was stationed, the situation was marginally better, but still desperate. His squadron managed to get airborne during some of the early engagements. The P-40s climbed to intercept Japanese formations, their pilots squinting into tropical sun to pick out the distinctive silhouettes of enemy aircraft. Grashio flew combat missions during those chaotic December days. The details of individual engagements blur in the historical record, as they blurred for the pilots themselves. Air combat produces sensory overload. Targets appear and disappear. Tracer rounds arc across the visual field. Radio chatter fragments into competing voices giving contradictory information. What is clear is that the American defense was overwhelmed not by lack of pilot skill, but by numerical and logistical reality. The Japanese had prepared for this campaign for years. Their aircraft were modern. Their pilots were combat experienced from China. Their supply lines were secure. The Americans had a handful of squadrons, limited replacement parts, and the dawning realization that reinforcement was not coming. Grashio survived the December fighting. His aircraft took damage. He made emergency landings. He transferred to whatever flyable P-40 remained available. The squadron designation became almost meaningless as aircraft and pilots were shuffled to cover gaps left by losses. By late December, organized air resistance in the Philippines was effectively over. The surviving pilots were reassigned to ground roles, defending Bataan alongside the infantry. Men who had trained to fight from 15,000 feet found themselves carrying rifles in jungle terrain they had never prepared for. The siege of Bataan lasted until April 1942. The Japanese had expected quick victory. Instead, they encountered stubborn resistance from a force that should have collapsed weeks earlier. Filipino and American soldiers held positions with dwindling ammunition, inadequate food, and no reasonable hope of relief. Gracio served through those months. His flying career was over for the duration. His survival skills were just beginning to be tested. When Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, approximately 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers became prisoners of war. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a forced movement of prisoners to Camp O'Donnell that would kill thousands through a combination of brutality, dehydration, and disease. Grashio marched. The distance was approximately 60 miles. The conditions were beyond what any military training had prepared him for. Guards bayoneted men who fell behind. Water was refused even when streams were visible alongside the road. The tropical sun produced core body temperatures that shut down organs in men already weakened by months of siege. Grashio survived by focusing on the next step, then the next. He did not think about the destination. He thought about moving his feet forward one more time, then one more time again. How he survived the march when stronger men died remains one of those mysteries of human physiology that statistics cannot fully explain. Perhaps his compact frame retained heat more efficiently. Perhaps his Italian ancestry had contributed some genetic advantage for endurance under caloric stress. Perhaps it was simply random chance selecting him from among thousands. He reached Camp O'Donnell. He did not die there. When the Japanese consolidated their prison camp system, Grashio was transferred to Davao Penal Colony on Mindanao. The journey by ship added another layer of trauma packed into holds with inadequate ventilation and sanitation. But he arrived. He survived. And at Davao, in the relative stability of systematic imprisonment, he began to think about the unthinkable. The Japanese administration at Davao Penal Colony operated on certain assumptions that had proven reliable across their expanding empire. First, that Western prisoners were fundamentally individual. They would not sacrifice themselves for strangers. The collective punishment system exploited this assumption effectively. A man might risk his own life for escape, but he would not condemn 9 others to death for his freedom. Second, that starvation produced compliance. Hungry men did not rebel. They conserved energy. They became focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Third, that the psychological defeat of Bataan had broken American military identity. These were not soldiers anymore. They were laborers. Their rank, their training, their esprit de corps had been dissolved by months of captivity and the visible evidence that their country had abandoned them. Fourth, that the jungle itself was a prison more secure than any fence. Even if a man escaped the compound, he faced miles of terrain that had killed indigenous populations for centuries. Without local knowledge, without supplies, without weapons, the jungle would return any escapee to Japanese control within days. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were supported by evidence from camps across Southeast Asia. The guards at Davao performed their duties with the efficiency of men who believed their system was working. Roll calls were conducted at predictable times. Work details were supervised, but not obsessively monitored. The caloric restriction was maintained at levels sufficient to produce labor, but insufficient to produce resistance. The camp commandant had reported to his superiors that Davao was functioning smoothly. Production quotas were being met. Mortality rates were within expected parameters. No significant disciplinary incidents had occurred. What the Japanese system failed to account for was adaptation. The prisoners at Davao had been there long enough to learn the patterns. They knew which guards were alert and which were careless. They knew the timing of inspections. They knew the blind spots in the compound's layout. More importantly, they had made contact with Filipino civilians who worked in and around the camp. The Japanese had employed local labor for various functions, believing that racial solidarity among Asians would prevent collaboration with American prisoners. This assumption proved incorrect. Filipino resistance networks had been operating since the fall of Bataan. Guerrilla units maintained communication lines across the islands. Some of these networks had threads that reached inside the prison camps. The guards who watched Samuel Grashio shuffle across the compound each morning saw a broken man. They did not see the small gestures of communication he had learned to exchange with certain Filipino workers. They did not see the information being passed through channels that operated below their threshold of suspicion. Gracio was not alone in his observations. A small group of prisoners had independently begun assessing the camp's vulnerabilities. Among them were other officers who had survived the Death March, men whose military training included intelligence gathering and operational planning. They did not trust easily. Trust in a prison camp was dangerous. Informers existed. Men broke under interrogation. A single careless word could result in 10 executions. But slowly, carefully, connections were made. Plans were discussed in fragments, never complete enough to be catastrophic if intercepted. Possibilities were assessed against the mathematical certainties that made escape seem impossible. The Japanese saw compliance. They saw defeat. They saw exactly what their system was designed to produce. They did not see the calculation changing. The plan that emerged in early 1943 was not heroic in its conception. It was logistical. The problem of collective punishment required a solution. If 10 men escaped, the remaining prisoners would face reprisals. This moral weight had stopped every previous escape discussion at Davao. The solution was simple in principle and terrifying in execution. Enough men would escape at once that reprisals against the entire remaining population would become impractical. The Japanese could not execute hundreds of laborers they needed for production quotas. This required coordination on a scale that prison escape literature rarely describes. It required trust among men who had learned that trust was lethal. It required Filipino guides who would risk their own lives and their families' lives to lead Americans through jungle they could not navigate alone. Grashio was not the plan's architect. The organizational work involved multiple officers, including Major Stephen Melnick and Lieutenant Colonel Melvin McCoy. But Grashio was part of the core group that assessed feasibility and committed to execution. The escape was scheduled for April 4, 1943, a Sunday, when guard routines were slightly more relaxed and work details provided cover for unusual movements. In the final days before the attempt, Gracio experienced something that survivors of extreme situations often describe. A strange calm settled over him. The decision had been made. The variables had been calculated. What remained was execution. He continued his routine. He shuffled across the compound. He met the guards' eyes with the same broken expression they expected. But internally something had shifted. He was no longer a prisoner waiting for rescue that would never come. He was an operational element in a planned action with a defined objective. On the morning of April 4th, the prisoners, selected for escape, moved through their assignments with careful normalcy. Nothing in their behavior suggested anything unusual. Then, at the coordinated moment, they moved. The initial breach was almost anticlimactic. A section of the compound perimeter that had been identified as vulnerable, guards who were positioned elsewhere, their attention on other matters, Filipino guides waiting at predetermined points outside the fence line. Grashio passed through the gap and into the jungle. For several minutes nothing happened. No alarms, no shots, no shouting. The silence was the weapon. The guards had assumed predictable prisoner behavior. They had not established the observation patterns that would detect a coordinated departure. By the time anyone realized men were missing, the escapees had a head start that could not be overcome. 10 men made it out that morning. They moved through jungle terrain that should have killed them, guided by Filipinos who knew paths invisible to outsiders. The Japanese response, when it finally came, was exactly what the planners had calculated. Furious, confused, unable to determine exactly when the escape had occurred or how many men were involved, and unable to execute the remaining prisoners without destroying their labor force. The jungle passage lasted weeks. Grashio and the other escapees moved through terrain that tested every survival skill they had, and many they had to improvise. The Filipino guides led them along routes that avoided Japanese patrols, through villages where resistance networks provided food and temporary shelter. The journey was not a continuous march. There were periods of waiting, hidden in jungle cover while search parties passed nearby. There were river crossings at night, the current threatening to separate the group. There were moments when disease or injury threatened to leave men behind. Gracio's body, weakened by a year of starvation, somehow found reserves that medical science would struggle to explain. The adrenaline of escape, the psychological shift from prisoner to active agent, the simple fact of moving toward something rather than waiting for death, all contributed to a physiological response that exceeded normal parameters. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. His feet blistered, and then the blisters burst, and then the raw skin somehow hardened into something that could keep moving. Tropical fevers came and went, but he did not stop. The group eventually made contact with larger guerrilla units operating in the Mindanao interior. These units had been cut off from conventional Allied support but maintained operational capability against Japanese occupation forces. From the guerrillas, the escapees learned what had happened in the year they had been imprisoned. The battles of Midway and Guadalcanal, the slow turning of the Pacific War toward American advantage, The fact that the defeat of Bataan, while catastrophic, had not been the final chapter. This information was itself a form of liberation. The prisoners at Davao had believed the war was lost. They had seen only Japanese strength and American absence. Learning that the trajectory had reversed gave meaning to survival that simple escape could not provide. Grashio and several others were eventually evacuated by submarine, the USS Narwhal, in March 1944. The submarine had made contact with guerrilla forces as part of the ongoing effort to support resistance networks and extract intelligence assets. Standing on the deck of an American vessel for the first time in over 2 years, Gracio experienced what he would later describe as a quiet disbelief. The physical transition was sudden. 1 hour he was a fugitive in enemy territory. The next hour he was among American sailors who spoke his language and offered him food that his stomach could barely process after so long on subsistence rations. The intelligence he and the other escapees carried was significant. Detailed information about Japanese prison camp operations, the location and conditions of American POWs, the networks of Filipino resistance fighters who had made escape possible. This information influenced Allied planning for the eventual liberation of the Philippines. The treatment of prisoners had been suspected, but not fully documented. Eyewitness accounts from escaped officers provided confirmation that accelerated liberation timelines. Gracio was promoted and given opportunities to serve in staff positions that would utilize his direct knowledge of enemy operations. He had proven something about the limits of captivity that went beyond his individual experience. The Davao escape remained the only successful mass breakout from a Japanese prison camp during the entire war. Other attempts were made. Other brave men tried to replicate what 10 prisoners had accomplished that April morning. None succeeded. The combination of factors that made Davao possible, the Filipino networks, the specific guard patterns, the timing of the decision, the physical capability of the men involved, could not be reproduced. The escape was not a template. It was a singular event that emerged from a specific confluence of variables, but it was proof that the impossible was sometimes possible. After the war, Samuel Grashio returned to the United States and attempted to rebuild a life that captivity had interrupted. He remained in the military for some years, serving in positions that recognized his experience without requiring him to constantly relive it. He married, he raised a family, he pursued the ordinary ambitions of a man who had been denied ordinariness for long enough to understand its value. He did not seek fame from his escape. He gave interviews when asked. He participated in reunions of survivors. He cooperated with historians who were documenting the war in the Pacific. But he did not build his identity around having been a prisoner or an escapee. He built it around being a husband, a father, a professional, a citizen. This restraint was common among survivors of extreme wartime experience. The men who had endured the most often spoke of it the least. They had nothing to prove to themselves. They had already answered the questions that captivity had posed. Gracio's memoir, eventually published, was titled Return to Freedom. The title captured something essential about his experience. Freedom was not a political abstraction. It was a physical reality he had lost and regained. He understood its texture in ways that those who had never lost it could not fully comprehend. He lived until 1999, reaching his 81st year. A long life, by any measure. A remarkable life, given what probability suggested about his survival chances in April 1942. The lessons his experience taught were not the dramatic ones that Hollywood prefers. There was no single moment of superhuman courage. There was no defiant speech to Japanese captors. There was no lone wolf heroism that transformed the war. There was instead a careful assessment of circumstances, a recognition that assumptions could be wrong, a willingness to act on logic that contradicted visible reality. The Japanese guards who watched Samuel Grashio had seen a broken man because they expected to see a broken man. Their system was designed to produce broken men, and it generally succeeded. The evidence before their eyes confirmed what their training had taught them to believe. They missed what they were not looking for. Gracio had understood something about the gap between appearance and intent. He had smiled at guards not because he had surrendered, but because the smile was useful camouflage. He had shuffled across the compound not because his spirit was broken, but because shuffling attracted less attention than walking with purpose. The war rewarded those who kept thinking when everyone else assumed the thinking was over. The guards had stopped analyzing because they believed analysis was complete. The prison system was functioning. The prisoners were controlled. The jungle was impassable. These conclusions were reasonable. They were supported by evidence. They were also wrong. In the space between reasonable assumption and actual fact, 10 men found a path that should not have existed. They found it because they never stopped looking.